December 22, 1944. Snow drifted silently across the Ardennes forest, settling over shattered trees, abandoned vehicles, and foxholes carved into the frozen earth. The silence never lasted long. Every few minutes, another artillery shell crashed through the woods, sending splinters of pine and frozen soil into the air. Thick smoke hung between the trees as exhausted American soldiers emerged from cover after another sleepless night. Their uniforms were stiff with ice. Their boots were soaked. Many had survived on cold field rations for days, expecting nothing more than another order to move forward. Then, through the maze of military traffic, an olive-drab truck slowly appeared. It wasn't carrying ammunition. It wasn't hauling fuel or wounded men. Instead, it belonged to the American Red Cross. Within minutes, the smell of fresh doughnuts and hot coffee drifted through the freezing air. Soldiers gathered quietly, warming their hands around steaming cups while Red Cross volunteers handed out doughnuts, cigarettes, magazines, and a few words of encouragement. To the Americans, it was a brief reminder of home. To many German observers, it represented something almost impossible to understand. How could an army fighting one of the largest battles in history spare trucks, fuel, ingredients, and personnel simply to boost morale? Behind that simple doughnut truck stood an industrial machine so vast that it could support both the brutal necessities of war and the humanity of the men fighting it. The story of those trucks is not really about pastries. It is about logistics, morale, and the overwhelming strength that helped the Allies defeat Nazi Germany. To understand why those vehicles became legendary, we must go back to the beginning of America's journey into World War II. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Europe descended into another catastrophic war. Blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed nation after nation, and within months much of Western Europe had fallen under Nazi control. Britain stood alone in the West while Germany prepared for an even larger conflict. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that the conflict would eventually demand America's industrial strength. Long before American troops entered combat, factories were already expanding production. Automobile plants began converting assembly lines to military vehicles. Steel mills increased output. Shipyards worked around the clock building cargo ships that would eventually carry millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic. Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. It was more than a slogan. It became a national mission. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, committing itself to defeating both Japan in the Pacific and Nazi Germany in Europe. The challenge was unlike anything the nation had ever faced. Millions of soldiers had to be transported across oceans. Every rifle, tank, aircraft, truck, artillery shell, gallon of fuel, and day's worth of food had to travel thousands of miles before reaching the battlefield. Success would depend not only on courageous soldiers but on an uninterrupted flow of supplies. American planners soon realized that sustaining an army meant more than delivering weapons. Months of combat produced physical exhaustion, but they also created emotional fatigue. Soldiers fought better when they felt connected to home, trusted their leaders, and believed they had not been forgotten. Military psychologists increasingly recognized morale as a genuine military resource. That realization shaped one of the most unusual support programs of the war. The American Red Cross had served troops during earlier conflicts, but World War II expanded its role dramatically. Thousands of volunteers joined blood drives, staffed military hospitals, and organized relief efforts. Among them were hundreds of young American women selected for a remarkable assignment. They would drive specially equipped mobile canteens called clubmobiles. Unlike traditional recreation centers located safely behind the front, clubmobiles were designed to move with advancing armies. Built inside modified buses and trucks, they carried compact doughnut-making equipment, large coffee urns, cigarettes, chewing gum, magazines, writing supplies, and portable music players. Their mission was simple. Instead of asking exhausted soldiers to travel for comfort, comfort would travel to them. The women chosen for the program received extensive training. They learned vehicle maintenance, military procedures, overseas operations, and emergency response. They understood they might work within range of enemy artillery, drive through bombed cities, or sleep wherever military operations allowed. Their work demanded courage without carrying a weapon. Inside each vehicle, space was used with remarkable efficiency. Small kitchens produced fresh doughnuts even under difficult conditions. Storage compartments held flour, sugar, cooking oil, powdered milk, coffee, and emergency supplies. Every inch reflected careful planning because every pound mattered during overseas transport. On paper, these trucks seemed insignificant compared to tanks and bombers. In reality, they represented something much larger. They reflected an extraordinary confidence that American industry could support not only the machinery of war but also the morale of the men fighting it. While many armies struggled simply to deliver enough ammunition and food, the United States was preparing to send fresh coffee and donuts toward active battlefields. That confidence would soon face its greatest test. By the spring of 1944, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were gathering in southern England for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Hidden behind endless rows of tanks, trucks, landing craft, and aircraft, the clubmobiles quietly prepared to cross the English Channel alongside them, ready to follow the road that led from the beaches of Normandy all the way into the heart of Nazi Germany. By the spring of 1944, southern England had become the greatest military staging ground the world had ever seen. Quiet farmland disappeared beneath endless rows of olive-drab tents, truck parks, airfields, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps. Every port along Britain's southern coast buzzed with activity as Liberty ships unloaded tanks, artillery, aircraft, medical supplies, and enough fuel to sustain an invasion of occupied Europe. Everything pointed toward one operation. Operation Overlord. For months, Allied commanders prepared for the assault that would open a second front against Nazi Germany. Every vehicle, every ration, and every gallon of gasoline was carefully accounted for. Success depended on more than the soldiers landing on the beaches, it depended on keeping them supplied after they landed. Among the thousands of military vehicles waiting in Britain stood more than 100 American Red Cross Clubmobiles. Unlike tanks or ambulances, they carried coffee urns, donut machines, cigarettes, magazines, and music. Their mission would begin only after the beachhead was secure. Then they would move ashore and follow the advancing armies across Europe. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Before sunrise, thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel while paratroopers descended behind German lines. Landing craft headed toward 5 beaches that would become legendary: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The first hours were brutal. At Omaha Beach, German machine gun fire pinned American troops against the shoreline. Engineers fought through obstacles while naval guns hammered coastal defenses. Casualties mounted rapidly, but by the end of the day the Allies had secured a fragile foothold in France. Only after engineers cleared roads and established supply areas did the clubmobiles begin crossing the channel. The war they entered was anything but safe. Normandy's hedgerows turned every field into a fortress. Narrow roads became crowded with tanks, bulldozers, ambulances, fuel trucks, artillery, and endless supply convoys. German artillery could strike without warning. Luftwaffe attacks, though far less frequent than earlier in the war, still threatened important transport routes. The clubmobile crews quickly adapted. They learned to park beside artillery units one day and field hospitals the next. They served engineers repairing bridges, infantry resting between attacks, bomber crews returning from missions, and truck drivers who spent nearly every waking hour hauling supplies toward the front. Producing fresh doughnuts in these conditions required remarkable planning. The ingredients had crossed the Atlantic aboard merchant ships that risked attack from German U-boats. They passed through warehouses in Britain before crossing the English Channel into Normandy. From there, Army transport units carried flour, sugar, coffee, cooking oil, and powdered milk through congested roads filled with military traffic. Each doughnut represented thousands of miles of coordinated logistics. To the soldiers, however, none of that mattered in the moment. What they remembered was the smell. After weeks of eating canned rations, the scent of fresh dough drifting through the air reminded them of home. Many veterans later admitted they could barely remember how the doughnuts tasted. What stayed with them was the feeling that someone had traveled through the chaos simply to remind them they hadn't been forgotten. As July turned into August, the Allied breakout from Normandy changed everything. Following Operation Cobra, American armored divisions smashed through German defenses and surged across France with astonishing speed. Some units advanced dozens of miles in a single day. Entire German formations collapsed as Allied forces raced toward Paris and the Belgian border. Rapid success created a new problem. The faster the armies advanced, the farther their supply lines stretched. Fuel became the greatest concern. Tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles consumed enormous quantities of gasoline. Ammunition stocks had to keep pace with advancing divisions. Spare parts, medical supplies, food, and replacement equipment all had to travel over increasingly long distances. To solve the crisis, the U.S. Army created one of the greatest transportation operations in military history: the Red Ball Express. Beginning in August 1944, thousands of trucks operated almost around the clock between Normandy and the advancing front. Most of the drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated transportation units. Working day and night, often under dangerous conditions, they hauled fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts over hundreds of miles. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance might have ground to a halt. The Clubmobiles benefited from the very same logistical miracle. Although they never received priority over combat supplies, they followed the roads kept open by engineers and maintained by transport units. As long as fuel continued flowing eastward, the Red Cross could continue reaching frontline soldiers. German intelligence officers watched this growing system with increasing concern. Captured supply depots revealed mountains of equipment. Destroyed trucks were quickly replaced. Bridges blown apart by retreating German forces reappeared within days as American engineers built steel and pontoon crossings at remarkable speed. It was becoming clear that the Allies possessed something Germany could no longer match. Not simply more tanks. Not simply more aircraft. But a logistical machine capable of replacing almost every loss while still finding room for trucks carrying coffee and fresh doughnuts. To many German officers, that abundance was almost as alarming as the American firepower itself. Yet the greatest test of that logistical system still lay ahead. As autumn faded into winter, Hitler prepared one final offensive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a battle that would push every American soldier, every supply convoy, and every club mobile to their absolute limits. The Ardennes. For decades, military historians had considered the region an unlikely place for a major offensive. Dense forests, narrow roads, steep valleys, and harsh winter weather made large-scale armored operations extremely difficult. It was for that very reason that Adolf Hitler chose it. He believed the Allies would never expect another massive German attack through terrain they considered unsuitable for tanks. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, that assumption was shattered. At 5:30 a.m., more than 1,500 German artillery pieces opened fire across an 80-mile front. Shells crashed into American positions from Belgium to Luxembourg, cutting telephone lines, destroying command posts, and throwing entire units into confusion. Under the cover of darkness, nearly 200,000 German troops and around 1,000 tanks began advancing through the snow-covered forests. It was Hitler's final gamble. His objective was bold. Break through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in two. If successful, the offensive might force the Western Allies into negotiating peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. For a few days, the plan seemed to work. The surprise was complete. American units, many of them exhausted after months of fighting, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by German armor emerging from the forests. Entire supply routes disappeared behind advancing enemy columns. Road junctions became battlegrounds. Military police struggled to direct endless streams of trucks moving in opposite directions. Retreating units mixed with fresh reinforcements rushing toward the front. The Ardennes became a maze of confusion. For Allied logistics, the battle posed an enormous challenge. Supply depots that had seemed safely behind the front suddenly found themselves threatened by advancing German forces. Quartermaster officers ordered warehouses emptied before they could be captured. Engineers raced to demolish bridges ahead of German tanks while constructing new crossings farther west. Fuel convoys changed routes almost hourly as intelligence reports updated the rapidly shifting battlefield. Despite the chaos, the system held together. Thousands of truck drivers continued delivering ammunition through icy mountain roads. Mechanics worked day and night repairing engines that struggled in sub-zero temperatures. Bulldozers cleared snow from narrow routes while engineers rebuilt bridges damaged by shellfire. Even the Red Cross Clubmobiles found themselves caught in the crisis. Only days earlier they had been serving troops preparing for Christmas. Now many received urgent orders to withdraw as German armored columns approached. Some crews narrowly escaped capture. Others drove through darkness without headlights, following military police along unfamiliar roads crowded with tanks, ambulances, artillery, and refugees. Every intersection carried uncertainty. A road that had been safe that morning could already be in German hands by evening. Yet wherever the American lines stabilized, the Clubmobiles returned. Sometimes they arrived only hours after the fighting had moved forward. Their stops were brief. Coffee was poured quickly. Doughnuts disappeared almost as soon as they were cooked. Soldiers barely had time to speak before another convoy received orders to move. Still, those few minutes mattered. Veterans later recalled standing beside olive drab trucks while snow drifted quietly around them. Steam rose from hot coffee into the freezing air. For a short moment, the sounds of artillery seemed farther away. The women serving them faced many of the same dangers. Several Clubmobile workers operated within range of German artillery. Others drove across roads littered with destroyed vehicles or passed through villages still smoldering from recent fighting. Although they carried no weapons, they accepted risks that few civilians would willingly face. Their courage earned enormous respect among frontline troops. One infantry veteran later wrote that seeing a Clubmobile after days of combat was proof that America had not forgotten them. It wasn't simply about the coffee or the donuts. It was about hope. Meanwhile, the German offensive began slowing. The deeper German forces pushed into Allied territory, the more difficult their own logistics became. Fuel trucks struggled to reach advancing armored units along narrow forest roads already clogged with military traffic. Allied resistance stiffened around key crossroads, delaying carefully planned timetables. Then the weather changed. For nearly a week, thick cloud cover had grounded most Allied aircraft, allowing German columns to move with relative safety. But on December 23, clear skies finally returned. Hundreds of Allied fighters and fighter bombers immediately took to the air. They attacked bridges, supply columns, fuel trucks, and armored formations trapped on icy roads. Transport aircraft dropped desperately needed supplies to the surrounded defenders of Bastogne. German convoys that had moved freely under cloud cover suddenly became easy targets from above. The offensive quickly lost momentum. German fuel reserves, already dangerously low, disappeared even faster. Many Panther and Tiger tanks were abandoned not because they had been destroyed in battle, but because they simply ran out of gasoline. By January 1945, Hitler's final offensive had failed. Germany had lost thousands of experienced soldiers, hundreds of armored vehicles, and precious fuel it could never replace. For the Allies, however, the battle proved something equally important. Their logistical system had survived one of the greatest surprises of the war. The same network that delivered ammunition had also delivered replacement tanks, medical supplies, winter clothing, engineering equipment, fuel, and, whenever possible, coffee and fresh donuts. It was a remarkable demonstration of industrial power. And with the Ardennes secured, nothing now stood between the Western Allies and the heart of Nazi Germany. The final advance toward the Rhine and the collapse of the Third Reich was about to begin. By the spring of 1945, the Western Front was moving with a speed that had been unimaginable only months earlier. The German army still fought fiercely in many places, but it was no longer capable of launching another offensive like the Battle of the Bulge. Fuel shortages crippled armored divisions. Railways lay in ruins after months of Allied bombing. Factories struggled to replace destroyed equipment, while experienced soldiers were becoming impossible to replace. The Allies sensed that the war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Only one major obstacle remained: the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had served as Germany's natural defensive barrier. Wide, fast-moving, and lined with steep banks, it offered defenders an enormous advantage. German commanders prepared to destroy every bridge they could, hoping to delay the Allied advance long enough to organize a final defense inside Germany itself. Then, on March 7, 1945, an extraordinary opportunity appeared. As elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division approached the town of Remagen, they expected to find the Ludendorff Bridge already demolished. Instead, to their surprise, it was still standing. German engineers had prepared explosives beneath the bridge, but the demolition failed to destroy it completely. Without hesitation, American troops rushed forward under heavy machine gun and artillery fire. Engineers worked frantically to cut demolition wires while infantry crossed the damaged bridge into the German heartland. It became one of the most dramatic moments of the European campaign. Within hours, thousands of American soldiers had established a bridgehead east of the Rhine. Engineers immediately began reinforcing the crossing while constructing additional pontoon bridges capable of carrying tanks, artillery, and heavy transport vehicles. Soon, an endless stream of traffic poured into Germany: Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, artillery batteries, fuel convoys, ambulances, engineering equipment, maintenance units. And among them, the familiar Red Cross Clubmobiles. Their journey had begun months earlier in Britain. They had crossed the English Channel after D-Day, followed the armies through France, survived the chaos of the Ardennes, and now rolled into Germany itself. The scenery had changed dramatically. Instead of French villages celebrating liberation, the roads now passed through shattered German cities scarred by years of bombing. Factories stood roofless. Railway stations were piles of twisted steel. Burned-out locomotives rested beside destroyed tracks, while abandoned military vehicles lined highways that had once carried the armies of the Third Reich. German resistance continued, but it was increasingly fragmented. Many units fought stubbornly, particularly around rivers and important road junctions. Others surrendered in large numbers, recognizing that further resistance could no longer change the outcome of the war. American soldiers frequently encountered columns of exhausted prisoners marching west under armed escort. For the Club Mobile workers, however, the advance into Germany revealed something even more disturbing. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps, including Buchenwald, Dachau, and many smaller camps, they encountered overwhelming evidence of the Nazi regime's crimes. Starving prisoners, mass graves, overcrowded barracks, and unimaginable suffering confronted soldiers who had spent months fighting across Europe. Many veterans later admitted that nothing they had experienced in combat prepared them for what they saw inside those camps. The Red Cross volunteers who accompanied advancing armies were equally shaken. Their mission suddenly extended beyond supporting frontline troops. They also assisted exhausted medical personnel treating survivors, engineers restoring basic infrastructure, and soldiers struggling to comprehend the horrors they had witnessed. In those final weeks, the Clubmobiles served fewer celebrations and more moments of quiet reflection. A cup of coffee was offered to a medic who had worked without sleep for 2 days. A fresh donut went to an engineer repairing a bridge crowded with refugees. A brief conversation comforted soldiers whose understanding of the war had been permanently changed. The purpose remained the same: to restore a small measure of humanity wherever war had nearly erased it. By April 1945, Allied armies were advancing almost everywhere. Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east while American and British troops pushed deeper into western Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. On April 30, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Just over a week later, on May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally across Europe. Church bells rang once again. Crowds filled city squares. Soldiers embraced one another, knowing the fighting in Europe had finally ended after nearly 6 years of devastating war. For the Clubmobiles, however, the mission did not end overnight. Millions of Allied servicemen still occupied Germany. Hospitals remained full. Refugees needed assistance. Roads, railways, and bridges required rebuilding. The trucks that had followed the front now followed the long process of recovery. Their story had become far greater than a tale about coffee and donuts. It had become proof that modern warfare was won not only by firepower, but by logistics, industry, and the determination to preserve hope even in the darkest moments. And long after the guns fell silent, that quiet legacy would remain one of the most remarkable and often overlooked stories of the Second World War. The war in Europe was over, but the story of the American Red Cross Clubmobiles was far from finished. Across Germany, millions of Allied soldiers remained on occupation duty. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Railroads were broken, bridges lay collapsed in rivers, and roads were crowded with refugees, prisoners of war, and civilians searching for missing family members. The enormous logistical network that had carried Allied armies across Europe now shifted toward rebuilding a continent devastated by 6 years of conflict. The Clubmobiles continued to travel those same roads. Instead of following advancing divisions, they now visited occupation headquarters, military hospitals, engineering battalions, and prisoner processing centers. Their passengers were no longer preparing for tomorrow's battle. They were helping restore order to a shattered Europe. By the end of the war, the scale of the program had become extraordinary. The American Red Cross had operated well over 100 Clubmobiles throughout the European theater. Together, they traveled hundreds of thousands of miles across Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Germany. They served millions of cups of coffee and produced millions of fresh doughnuts for American servicemen. Behind every stop stood an immense logistical system that stretched from American factories to Atlantic convoys and finally to the muddy roads of Europe. Each doughnut told a larger story. The flour had crossed an ocean, the coffee had survived submarine-infested waters. The fuel had been allocated by military planners. The truck had been maintained by army mechanics. The roads had been repaired by combat engineers. What looked like a simple act of kindness was actually the final link in one of history's greatest supply chains. Veterans never forgot it. Decades after the war, many former soldiers rarely spoke first about tanks or artillery. Instead, they remembered the warmth of a steaming cup of coffee after days in freezing foxholes. They remembered music playing softly beside a clubmobile parked near the front. Most of all, they remembered the Red Cross women who treated every soldier not as another number in a massive army, but as an individual far from home. Those moments mattered. Military historians today recognize morale as one of the hidden foundations of military success. Food, rest, medical care, mail, entertainment, and simple human connection all contributed to keeping soldiers mentally and emotionally capable of enduring prolonged combat. The Clubmobiles became one of the clearest examples of that philosophy in action. The historical record, however, tells an important story about the title of this documentary. There is no surviving evidence that German generals literally stood in disbelief at the sight of doughnut trucks. No official German report focuses specifically on pastries arriving at the front. What German commanders and intelligence officers did repeatedly recognize was something much larger. They were astonished by the sheer scale of American logistics. They faced an enemy whose supply system rarely collapsed, whose damaged bridges were rebuilt within days, whose destroyed trucks were quickly replaced, and whose armies seemed to possess an endless flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment. Within that enormous system, the existence of Clubmobiles became a symbol of American abundance. If the United States could devote vehicles, fuel, and personnel to serving coffee and fresh doughnuts near active battlefields while still maintaining overwhelming combat power, it demonstrated an industrial capacity Germany simply could not match. In that sense, the doughnut truck became a metaphor. Not for luxury, but for confidence. Confidence that supplies would continue arriving tomorrow. Confidence that reinforcements were already on the way. Confidence that an industrial nation stood firmly behind every soldier fighting thousands of miles from home. When the Clubmobile program eventually ended, most of the trucks were retired or converted for other uses. The women who had served aboard them returned to civilian life, becoming teachers, nurses, writers, and community leaders. Many rarely spoke about their experiences, yet they had traveled through bombed cities, crossed newly built bridges, endured artillery fire, and witnessed both the triumph of liberation and the horrors of the concentration camps. Their contribution was never measured in territory captured. It was measured in resilience. Today, museums preserve photographs of smiling Red Cross workers handing fresh doughnuts to muddy infantrymen somewhere along the road to Germany. Veterans' memoirs continue to recall those brief encounters with remarkable affection. Historians still study the clubmobiles because they reveal a truth often overlooked in military history. Wars are won not only by those who pull the trigger. They are won by the mechanics who repair engines before dawn. By the engineers who rebuild bridges under fire. By the truck drivers who never stop moving. By the doctors and nurses who save the wounded. And sometimes, by volunteers who carry nothing more than hot coffee, fresh donuts, and a reminder that even in humanity's darkest conflict, compassion can travel beside war. That is why the story of the American donut truck still endures today, not because they changed a single battle, but because they revealed the extraordinary strength of a nation that understood victory required more than weapons. It required sustaining the people who carried them. And in the end, that quiet commitment became one of the many reasons the Allies prevailed.